What's going on? Welcome to the episode. Today we're going to be digging into the fundamentals of fat loss in regards to calories and food quality or choices. So we're going to answer the question, is a 2,000 calorie daily diet from hyperpalatable processed foods going to yield you the same fat loss results as a 2,000 calorie daily diet from single ingredient whole food? So does food quality matter from a purely fat loss result standpoint? And if so, how much? Let's find out. First off, what is required for fat loss? In order to lose fat, we have to be in a calorie deficit, which means that we need to be expending more energy than we're consuming. And this concept is identical to your budget. If you're spending more money than you're making, your bank account is going to go into the red. A calorie deficit is absolutely necessary for fat loss. There are no two ways about this, but there is more to this calories and fat loss story than meets the eye. So let's explore it. We've established that a calorie deficit is a must in order to lose fat, but let's zoom in just a little bit tighter. And when we do, we come across something called the thermic effect of food, which is just a fancy way of saying the calories that are burned in the process of digestion. So the easiest way to think about the thermic effect of food is via bank transaction fees. So certain food groups and food options have higher transaction fees than others. For example, the three major macronutrients are protein, carbs, and fats. And it turns out that of these three macros, protein has the highest transaction fee, followed by carbs, and lastly fats. Meaning, when we eat protein, a chunk of the calories that are in that protein are essentially discarded in the digestion process, and the same goes for carbs and fats, but just to a lesser degree. What this means is that when we eat protein, we have a high bank transaction fee. When we eat carbs, we have a medium bank transaction fee. And when we eat fats, we have a very small transaction fee. And of course, we all hate bank fees, right? But for the sake of this explanation or analogy, we want higher fees because they add to our spending, aka calorie deficit. So we've got the thermic effect of food in regards to macronutrients, so protein, carbs, and fat. And we've actually also got the thermic effect of food in relation to specific foods as well. For example, whole unprocessed foods in their original form have a higher thermic effect than processed foods in a more of a pre-digested or quote-unquote broken down form, which means that whole unprocessed single ingredient foods have higher transaction fees than highly processed foods due to, again, digestion. So we essentially use more calories digesting unprocessed foods than we do processed foods. So more calories are being used to digest something like oatmeal than things like gummy bears. So this whole thermic effect of food has two elements to it as we just laid out. The macronutrient element via protein, carbs, and fat, as well as the unprocessed versus processed element via single ingredient whole foods versus highly processed foods. So the two ends of this spectrum could be something like a lean piece of turkey breast versus a processed vegetable oil like soybean oil. Reason being is, protein has the highest transaction fee of the macronutrients, and turkey breast is very rich in protein, and it's a single ingredient whole food, while fat has the smallest transaction fee, and an oil is an example of a highly processed fat because it's extracted and concentrated from a soybean in this case. So hopefully you're starting to see that the foods with the highest transaction fees are going to be single ingredient protein-rich foods like lean meat, fish, seafood, eggs, etc., followed by single-ingredient carb-rich foods like potatoes, yams, oats, vegetables, fruit, etc., followed by fat-rich foods like avocado and nuts, for example. On the other end of the spectrum, the foods with the lowest transaction fees are going to be highly processed ones like donuts, cake, pizza, pastas, chips, candy, etc. All of these foods are not only highly processed, but they're also low in protein and high in both carbs and fats. So for lack of a better word, we essentially absorb more calories from processed foods than we do from unprocessed foods due to how they're digested. So again, high transaction fees with unprocessed foods and low transaction fees with processed foods. So if we circle back around to our original question of, is a 2,000 calorie diet, or insert whatever number you want here, containing single ingredient whole foods going to yield you the same fat loss results as a 2,000 calorie diet from highly processed foods? The answer is no. The diet made up of single ingredient whole foods is going to yield better fat loss results due to higher transaction fees via digestion. And therefore, for lack of a better word again, you're going to absorb fewer total calories from an unprocessed food diet, which creates a larger calorie deficit than the highly processed diet, even though they both contain 2,000 calories. So are all calories created equal in regards to fat loss? No, they are not. Now that addresses the fat loss question in a vacuum, right? But in the real world, we also want to look at things like health, satiation, diet sustainability, digestion. All of these aspects matter as well because they're massive components when it comes to adherence to a dietary approach, or essentially following your diet consistently. Health-wise, I don't think that we really need to dig very far into this one. When we compare the 2,000 calorie diet from unprocessed foods versus processed foods, I think that everyone is aware that the unprocessed diet is going to be far superior for health. Satiation-wise, the unprocessed diet is also far more filling, meaning you're going to feel more full, relatively speaking, with that 2,000 calories via unprocessed foods than you are via processed foods. And hunger is a massive part of the fat loss equation. Hunger is not sustainable. And if you're feeling hungry on a consistent basis, unfortunately, your program or plan isn't set up properly. Something is clearly off as far as food choices and or amounts go if you feel hungry on a daily basis. You really shouldn't feel genuine hunger until you get very, very lean. And I'm talking about a level of leanness that most folks don't even have a desire to get to, meaning hunger is essentially a non-issue when you structure your plan properly. One added component to eating an unprocessed diet versus a processed one that folks often aren't aware of is that a lot of packaged foods actually contain a larger portion than what's listed on the package. So for example, let's say that you pick up a bag of chips from the store and it says that it's 50 grams worth of chips on the bag. There's often more than 50 grams in there. It might be closer to, say, 60 grams. And you might be thinking, well, what's 10 grams, right, Marcus? Don't sweat the small stuff. But the truth is, that adds to your daily calorie intake. And if you're eating a fair number of prepackaged foods on a consistent basis, all of these seemingly small portions add up to a lot, especially because these foods are so calorie dense to begin with. In the case of an extra 10 grams of chips, if the bag was meant to be 50 grams, you now need to add an extra 20% of the calorie total for that bag because 10 grams is another 20% of the total portion. So when you think about it that way, it's really not a trivial amount. So if you're counting your calories really closely, you can still be eating quite a bit more than you thought you were eating when you're consuming these highly processed foods just because the manufacturing process isn't perfect. And they most often overshoot the portion versus undershoot it because the companies can't risk recall, right? If it says 50 grams, it's a smarter business move to go with 55 or 60 grams versus 40 or 45 grams because the buyer isn't going to be upset by a bigger portion, but they might be by a smaller portion. It's essentially risk management 101 in regards to business. Also, these packaged foods have lower transaction fees, so you're not only consuming a larger portion than you thought oftentimes, you're also consuming a larger portion of a food with a smaller transaction fee. This stuff adds up. Cravings are another big part of this equation. Essentially, you crave what you eat. So folks that eat very healthfully on a daily basis actually crave healthful foods, which is super cool. However, it is a bit of a double-edged sword situation because folks who eat a lot of highly processed, hyper-palatable foods also crave those. So just know that if you are transitioning to a more healthful eating approach, there is a bit of a limbo period in regards to going from a highly processed diet to an unprocessed one. However, your taste buds and cravings will adapt, and if you're diligent, you should start noticing differences within no more than 7 to 10 days, which is super quick. Digestion is another massive component at play here. The unprocessed diet is going to keep your digestion running super smoothly, and the processed one, probably not so much, right? Everyone knows what I'm talking about here via personal experience. Now, there are going to be outliers that need to dial things in further than simply eating single ingredient foods in order to square away their digestion, but the vast majority of folks fortunately won't. Eating single ingredient foods should do the trick in and of itself. So now we're at the most important part of the episode. How can you use this information on a daily basis to help you reach your fat loss goals? Favor unprocessed single ingredient whole foods because they are healthier, more filling, they digest better, they make you feel better, they minimize cravings, they have higher transaction fees, and ultimately they yield better fat loss results. Now, does this mean that you can't or shouldn't ever eat processed foods? Of course not. You can enjoy some treats here and there and absolutely still lose fat. You just don't want to favor treat-like foods simply because they don't set you up for success in the same way that whole foods do, both in the short term and the long term. The oversimplified eat less and move more rarely, if ever, works in the real world because it's so hard to simply cut things out from a quote-unquote regular diet and feel full. Instead, we want to reduce our calories but substitute less filling foods with highly filling, nutrient-dense foods, and therefore you feel super satiated but with a lower overall calorie intake. That's the name of the game when it comes to fat loss. Also, be sure to get enough protein in your diet because it's so filling, and as an added bonus, it has the highest transaction fees. You can fill in the remainder of your calories from single ingredient carbs and fats, depending on your personal preference. Yes, carbs have higher transaction fees than fats, and most folks are eating far too much fat these days, while they demonize carbohydrates, which I've talked about plenty of times on the pod, but that's a rabbit hole that we're not going to dig into today. So emphasize protein and fill in the rest of your calories based on your personal preferences around carbs and fat. If you're interested in applying for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness and feel free to friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. Leaving a review really helps the pod grow and reach more folks, so if you're willing to do that, I truly appreciate it. And if you've already left a review, thank you. Lastly, be sure to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're using. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you found this helpful, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.